If you have been attending or watching the last couple weeks of protests sparked by the death of George Floyd, you may have noticed something.
Defund the police!
Defund the police! This system of policing has got to go.
Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it.
But what does it actually mean to defund the police? And why are so many people calling for it to happen?
Defunding the police is saying, let's look at this giant stack of money that we're spending on policing. Let's start reinvesting that money into communities, and let's see if, as we go through that process, we can find ways of not having to rely on policing long term.
Tahir's right, we spend a lot of money on policing. The city of Los Angeles spends $3 billion per year on the police department. That's almost a third of the overall budget. But the LAPD consumes more than half the money that's unrestricted. That's money that the mayor and city council can spend on any program. Activists have seized on that figure as proof that the city has its priorities wrong. But big police budgets haven't always meant safer cities, especially for Black and brown communities. The police have been criticized time and again for excessive use of force. About 1 in 1,000 Black men and boys can expect to die at the hands of police. That's about 2.5 times more likely than white men.
First, when people hear the phrase defund the police, the first thing that they need to know is that this isn't new. This isn't something that people have just started talking about in the last couple of weeks. I think a lot of protesters, they're getting a taste in the last week or so of the sort of violence, the willingness to arrest for any reason and no reason at all. And Black communities are saying, welcome to our lives. This is what we've been experiencing for ages. A lot of this is baked into decades, if not centuries, of this kind of warrior style training.
If you think police were created to protect citizens, the history really doesn't back that up. In early America, what we see is that wealth was produced by exploiting the labor of populations. And so really the police emerged to ensure that exploitation can sort of proceed undisturbed, or that populations don't become too unruly, even though they may be suffering from inequality. A lot of our institutions in America, we kind of think of them as like, well, yeah, they started with this difficult history, but things slowly get better. And again, history doesn't back you up if that's how you think about it. Obviously, during the Jim Crow era, the police were not here to support Black people. And then we know what happened in the 60s, where you had rebellions in over 200 cities, much like what's going on today.
In 1991, the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles and the exoneration of those officers led to a national outcry of injustice. Since then, police killings across the country have continued to spark outrage. But efforts to reform police departments have repeatedly come up short.
The two biggest crime reform efforts, both of them, by the way, by Democrats, basically sort of pivoted around this idea of community policing. But what did they actually do? They just put billions of dollars each time. So it's really about telling people that the police are here for you, but not actually making the structural changes in policing and the incentive structure that would make the police serve people. And that is what happens with community policing, and that's why it fails.
In the last 5 years, Minneapolis instituted a number of police reforms that included implicit bias training, body cameras, and the appointment of the department's first Black police chief. But ultimately, those efforts did not stop George Floyd's death.
I've been trying to find the words to describe what happened. And all I keep coming back to is that he should not have died.
With some of these reforms, the language is rebuilding trust with the community. My question is, but if you want to rebuild trust, you have to have had trust at one point. What year in American history did any Black or brown community have trust with the police?
Part of the problem, says California State Assembly member Sidney Kamlager, is that police have been tasked to do more than fight crime.
You might have someone who's homeless, who's walking around, who's causing a disturbance. You might have someone who's mentally ill, who's also walking around and making people nervous. Right now, in any of those situations, our response is the same: to call 911. Law enforcement is not trained to be social workers. They are not trained to offer mental health services. That is not in their scope.
They are showing up into situations, ready to use force. They are showing up into situations and acting in ways that often escalate those situations as opposed to de-escalate them. What Black communities are saying is that we need to wipe the slate clean and think entirely differently about how we do this in a way that isn't going to be rooted in the same kind of unhealthy cultural norms that have so deeply infected police departments across the country.
Earlier this year, Camlogger introduced a bill on the California State Assembly floor that would provide $16 million in state funding to community-based emergency services as an alternative to law enforcement.
Ultimately, I think every community wants to be safe, but we don't want to see people unfairly treated, abused. We don't want to see fatalities, and we don't want to have communities that end up becoming more unsafe because they're afraid of calling the police when they need something taken care of. How do we find other ways to solve problems?
There are several organizations across the country that provide alternate approaches to relying on police. In Eugene, Oregon, Cahoots, or Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets, responds to 20% of the city's 911 calls by deploying medics and crisis workers who have mental health training, instead of sending police. In Sacramento, Mental Health First, a part of the Anti-Police Terror Project, provides support and de-escalation assistance for people experiencing a mental health crisis.
We have to be peer-run and peer-led because no one can inform us on how to best deal with someone in crisis than someone who has been in crisis. We show compassion because really, for me personally, safety is more about, especially in this context, is about being heard and being listened to.
Defunding is our first step, but yes, what we want is to work towards a world where police aren't necessary anymore. And so I think that's what organizers and activists are saying is, look, we are, relying on these people to keep us safe, and they're not doing that. So let's try something else.